Welcome everyone to our Not at the Museum Thursday night. As usual, I would like to begin our program with a land acknowledgement. The Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinatan peoples. The Chinatan people have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. Tonight, we are here for the lecture, The Healing Path of Indigenous Through Self-Determination and Use of Culturally Relevant Approaches, given by Dr. Pamela Williamson. And as in the past with these lectures, we will have the opportunity to have a Q&A session following her lecture. So if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat function if you're joining us on Zoom. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can put them right into the comment section at the bottom. And following the lecture, I will read those questions out for you for Dr. Williamson to answer. So Dr. Williamson is a member of the Moose Deer Point First Nation and from Sturgeon Clan. After a lengthy time working in both health and post-secondary education sectors, and from her personal experience, Dr. Williamson is able to offer keen insights into understanding the realities of living experienced by First Nations people. Dr. Williamson is a strong advocate of truth and reconciliation recommendations as a mean to increase understanding and positive and productive relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us, Pam.
As I unmute, it's good to be here. Thank you very much, Christine. So I am also very happy and welcome everybody who's here today. And I am about to share my screen, but the first thing I want to be able to say to everybody is I'm from Northern Ontario, Manitoulin Island, and we're having a smoke issue here as it is being experienced all across Ontario. And at the moment, I'm asking for your good thoughts that I have no problems with my connectivity tonight. So I am about to get started here and provide you with a look of my screen. So again, it's about Indigenous resiliency and growth, the role of self-determination and cultural resurgence of cultural ways. So introductions, I was already introduced. It's unfortunate I can't get to meet you, but I am pleased to be able to be talking with you tonight. So just as a brief review of what we're going to be talking about, I am going to do a brief recap of the three sessions that I've already had. And I'm saying brief, so we're not going to go into things, but it is important that you get a sense of how things are all connected. Also talking about culturally relevant approaches and self-determination. Those are probably what is most critical. Those are the things that we talk about a lot as part of very important means towards health and wellness. And so it is really important to say why those are important. Overview of Indigenous health, wellness, and other practices today. So we've been talking and we'll continue to talk about the concerns, but there also is been light and there's been things that have been progressing that I'd like to share with the groups. So the purpose of the presentation is to connect it with previous presentations, as I said, to create an understanding between the relevance of retaining and regaining one's culture and practices to one's growth, health, and well-being, to demonstrate successes related to the resurgence of traditions and culture in the status of Indigenous health, well-being, and socioeconomic conditions. So again, I'm going to be talking about those, but I honestly feel sometimes that I'm giving you a bit of the tip of the iceberg, if I can use that analogy, because there's things that I'm not talking about that I'm sometimes afraid that I'm making it feel simplistic, that it's not complex, but knowing that as in everything, things are more complex than sometimes what you can describe. So I've put this preface in with all of the presentations. So it is important for me to say that the sources and citations have been provided for all the materials that I've used, that I've gotten from received or I've looked at from other people. Appropriate recognition. Uh, Appropriate recognition is attributed to all original contributors with no intention to break copyright parameters. So any anecdotal information is offered from my personal experiences as a First Nation person. So in my work, in what I've done as a volunteer, in my career within post-secondary education and with primary healthcare, and also in a volunteer capacity. The presentation focuses more on First Nations, given this is my area and my knowledge and experience as a First Nation person. Uh, I am from Moose Deer Point First Nation, and that is where my status comes from. And I'm very proud of my community and the good things that are happening there. Questions and discussions are encouraged. And again, there will be opportunity at the end with any questions. So please, there is no shame in asking a question and wanting to learn. Please feel free to ask questions that may help you understand things and clarify things that I've talked about. The presentation is intended to contribute to positive learning and a greater understanding of Indigenous people. So going into a bit of a recap, Indigenous people are distinct with differing customs, histories, language, historical lands, traditional medicines, social structures, songs, stories, historical homes, clothing, implements, and it goes on. Indigenous people can be found both historically and today all across Turtle Island. So again, I put a few of the different languages and the greetings just to give you a sense of the differences in not only culture, but in languages. So there is a legal recognition of Indigenous people in Canada. Indigenous people are recognized by the Government of Canada with having varying degrees of rights. So this is legal rights to the land, to subsistence, resources, and activities, to self-determination and self-government. And you see the word self-determination. That is a word I'm going to be talking about today. To practice one's own culture and customs, including language and religion. So in previous times, the legal right to practice one's own culture and customs was not afforded to First Nation peoples. So to have that as part of our rights, it is very precious. The rights are based on inherent and collective rights as being the original people and occupiers of lands currently occupied by Canada. Having existing societies and orders prior to the arrival of Europeans, and you will often hear the words from time immemorial. The graphic that I gave you is also a teaching about being from Turtle Island. And again, it is an oral story. It is not necessarily an oral story from all cultures, but it is from one that I am familiar with. So again, I put this slide in just to be able to give individuals a sense of what are the Indigenous cultures in Canada. And there are 3 distinctive groups of Indigenous people that are recognized under the Canadian Constitution. So those are First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. So I'm trying to give you just a very broad overview of Indigenous people. I've put this slide into the last presentation as well. So right now, to get a sense of Indigenous people, I think when I started teaching back in 1980s, was it 80s? No. Oh, I'm older, but it was the 1990s when I started teaching. I believe the population, we were less than 2%. So just to give you a sense of the total Indigenous population in Canada, was approximately 1 million, almost 7 million, which is about 4.6% of the population in 2016. And it's 1.8 million as of 2021, which is approximately 5% of the population. So if you can look at the graph that I've included here, it's to give you a sense of in every province and territory what the percentage or what where most of the where Indigenous people can be found. So it's across all Indigenous groups. So Indigenous populations as an overview, again, I've said it's approximately 4 to 5%, and we remain the fastest growing population in Canada. So 60% are approximately are First Nation. Métis are approximately 33%, and Inuit are approximately 4%. So again, it's to give you a sense of the three groups and percentage-wise, the populations. So as part of this brief recap that I am about to go into just in a minute, I wanted to, and I think the best way to get a message across or to try to relay what I am trying to articulate. So what we did as part of previous presentations was we went into prior to European contact, and I've got prior to European contact and contact. So you'll see that I've already have a mistake there, and that I'm human. And I make errors. So I'm not sure why I put contact and contact, but it was prior to European contact. So what were First Nations? They were many different groups all across this land of North America and into South America. And with their own cultures, their own nations, their own nationhoods. When with the introduction of European imposed changes and restrictions, and we went into some examples of those impositions and the changes that occurred. And I think I received a comment at one point about, was there any positive things that happened with European contact? Make no mistake that there was many positive things in terms of the technologies and medicines and many other things. But there was also a number of things that were very restrictive and repressive. And it's to be able to say and provide those as examples that we went through, because it did create long-term negative implications for Indigenous people. And again, we went into a number of things that have occurred as a result of those things that were imposed, those things that were taken away, the laws that prohibited and repressed or restricted what Indigenous people could do. I just had a conversation with somebody, and it was a family member, Indigenous, and they were not aware that when individuals went into World War I and II, that they could possibly have either lost their rights as an Indigenous person, or the fact that when they came out of the war, that the benefits that were given to other returning soldiers were not available to them. Things like, the ability to go to school, to learn a trade, the employment opportunities. So that was just a small conversations, but it's to give you an implication of things that were truly created to marginalize Indigenous people, but also treated them very differently. So then the very last is talking about the path to healing, wellness, and growth. So despite the negative things that is part of our culture as Indigenous people, that is part of our reality, the fact is that there has been a growth, there has been healing, there has been some positive going towards a positive journey that I can talk about tonight. So some of the key messages based on those four things that I just showed you. So initially, original peoples were self-reliant, self-governing, and thriving cultures. European contact changed things. And it sounds potentially dramatic, but it did change things forever. So, and I talked about it being both positive and adversely. So the restrictions, legal in nature, included restrictions to the land, economic growth. And then we talked in the past about the residential day schools, the 60 scoop, uh, um, restrictions to what you could do in terms of your cultural practices, to languages and so on. Indigenous people were and are treated differently from other Canadians. If anything that I can give you as a message, that continues to be true. The long-term and lingering interpersonal trauma, which was that third bubble of these experiences, manifested themselves. So when you go through something that is traumatic and that is negative, it does have an impact on the individual. It could have an impact on their family, and it could have an impact on their community. But when you think of that happening generations after generations, you can, I'm hoping that you can understand, or that I'm giving you a sense that it has created a lot of the conditions and the struggles that Indigenous people are facing today. And some of the things that we had talked about was self-harm, whether it be drugs, alcohol, suicide, mental health and addiction issues, a sense of self, who am I? The term is anomi, family and community violence, and so many other different dysfunctions. So the long-term and lingering impact of the restrictions and marginalizations have adversely impacted so the individuals, the community, economic growth, community infrastructure, cycles of social assistance. There are so many things that have been a product of all of the issues that we have been experiencing. So again, just the final key message from the recap: Indigenous history needs to be understood in order to understand the status of Indigenous people today, as a first step to helping change the future. So changing the future is what we are anticipating, that we look forward to, that we are determined to do. Because Indigenous relationships are strongly tied to the federal and provincial governments, they have responsibilities to support Indigenous self-determination and growth. And again, there are examples that I'm going to be highlighting of things that have been put in place and that are in process. Canadians can also help support Indigenous self-determination and growth. So what factors work together to adversely impact Indigenous health and wellness? So because of experiencing the significant health disparities, and then contributing to that, factors such as poverty, food insecurity, lack of employment opportunities, suitable housing, safe water supply. And again, those are all things that I can, go back, and I did cite some of them and supported it with some data. Those are things that are reality. Those are things that are part of, that are working, that are affecting Indigenous health and wellness. Societal factors certainly were the colonialism, racism, judicial injustice, and social marginalization and exclusion, and so on. So just anecdotally, so I was raised on reserve. I was raised on reserve. I guess I was raised on what used to be reserve, but we were right next to a First Nation, and I was not able to go to the school that was on reserve because it was Catholic and we were Protestant. So I ended up, and my siblings went to a school that was in a public school in a non-Indigenous community. And as a result of going to the school, I never really thought about the fact that things were different for us, because I did not experience discrimination from my peers that I can remember, but just different things that happened. For example, only the First Nation children who there were a few of us that went to the public school, had to go to, they would bring in this big bus, this big van, and we would have our teeth addressed in this van. So we would be called out of school and we would go to the van to have our teeth looked after, or they did, dental surgery, like they filled cavities and that kind of thing. But it felt weird because nobody else had to go on that bus, just, the Indigenous kids. So it made me aware, that I was a little different. And then when it came to public health, things that were going to happen to public health, all of the First Nation children in a grade school that went from grades 1 to grade 8, we all had to go together all the way down. We had to walk down a sidewalk in this little town, and we had to go to this office, which was for public health, I think. I'm pretty sure it's public health. And we had to be checked for nits and things like that. So again, it was those subtle things, I think, that always made me aware of the fact that I was different, that there was things about me that, because I was Indigenous, that it was different. So why is cultural identity so important? So this is something that is it the end all of end alls? I personally think it is. There are certainly so many other things that we need to put in place in order for Indigenous people to become more holistically well. But it is important. So cultural practices and traditions serve many purposes. Often these traditions not only help define a community, they help create the community. They also have healing qualities in that they they help us make connections within ourselves to feel a sense of belonging and to strengthen a sense of identity and purpose. So the reconstruction of communities devastated by colonization begins with the restoration of tradition, rituals, and language. So these are quotes from different individuals. So when it comes to talking about holistic health, I felt it was important, and I am not a traditional teacher, but I am I really believe in the importance of the medicine wheel. So the medicine wheel is something that is used for teaching, and there are so many different teachings that apply to the medicine wheel. It is amazing. If you ever have a chance to hear somebody talk about teachings from the medicine wheel, I really strongly encourage you to seek that out, because I think it is life affirming. It certainly, to me, is a way that I practice and that I walk with in my life, knowing about the fact that I need to keep things in balance, which is a really key thing about the medicine wheel. So from this perspective, as part of the teachings that I've received, for an individual to be healthy, holistically healthy, they have to have a balance within themselves. So these 4 things are emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental. Without having a balance there, you are a person who's unhealthy, that there are things that are going to happen to you, that are going to impact you because you haven't taken care of one of these components. So if you were to, for example, not be physically active person, and you did that forever, it certainly would affect your physical health. It would affect your heart. It could affect many things. Mentally, if you do not believe in becoming a lifelong learner, the fact is that without making your brain curious and wanting to learn something new, you really can become stagnant. And the same with emotions, that if you are not addressing and supporting your emotional needs, again, that is a case of where you can develop some issues. And this is the part that I think that I love the best about being an Anishinaabe, is that we can talk about spiritual. I know that as a professor at college level, it was not something that you talked about in terms of praying. And yet, as a cultural person in our area, as an Indigenous person, we could talk about prayers and the fact that it was important that there was a sense of connectivity to something that was bigger and greater than ourselves. So that is the teaching of being holistic. So as an Indigenous person, those are the things that we remind ourselves that we need to keep those things in balance. Um, so it goes further, and there's many, as I said, many teachings, but it grows out from there, where the political, environmental, social, economic, financial parts of a community, that if those things aren't also in balance, that community also can be impacted. So again, it's just a further teaching about the fact that the individual should have health and wellness, and so should communities. So I've already talked about what the medicine wheel is, but I think I wanted to make sure that I spoke of things um, a little bit more, and I knew I would forget some things. So again, I talked about the fact that it's an application for many different teachings. The circle represents the wholeness and interconnectivity of everything, both interpersonally and with broader application to others in the environment. It represents balance with the outcome of being holistically healthy and well. So it is an old teaching. It is something where they have found medicine wheels or historical circles of stone have been found in different places across Canada and the States. So I just gave a sense of those. But to be able to say it is rooted in a very old teaching. It is also, though, to be reminded that it is not a teaching that is applicable or used by all Indigenous groups and cultures. It is something that I am familiar with, and I can speak from that perspective. Quadrants are represented by different colors. So if you've seen medicine wheels, different teachings, different cultures potentially use different colors. But the colors that are most common that I've seen are the black, red, white, and yellow. And the quadrants are 4, but they may be placed in different areas. Used in traditional teachings and ceremonies, and education as a guide for healing and a code of living. The medicine wheel teachings are a guide for awareness of self, others, and the environment, a guide for one's life journey. Teachings are as important to guide communities collectively, as well as businesses, governments, or governance, as a universal and value based practice. So I gave you a little bit of teaching from my experience and from what I've been given. But it is to be able to say that that in itself is a very significant teaching that is used as part of our cultural way of being. So many Indigenous people are seeking to regain their traditions and their cultural ways, spirituality, medicines, and their languages. I'm humbled by one young man. A friend of mine is a language speaker, a Ojibwe, and she is a strong advocate, and she's been teaching for a long time, and she is the most amazing person. And she had one individual who went from being not a speaker and who is currently a speaker. So she's always shown that as an example that everybody can do it, and that language is such an important part of our culture, that of any culture, language is significant. That I don't know, when I finally completely retire, I know that there's many things that I should be doing, and the language is one thing that I should, I think, make a bigger investment in. So people are looking to regain their cultural ways, and there may be some argument that it has always been there, and that's true. It has been, but from my experience in being a professor and seeing the students that came in, and where I've worked in health, that it just is something that is something that we are all very hungry for, is to be able to be around and present and learning about our cultural ways. Returning to the use of cultural practices is part of healing from intergenerational trauma. So that is a very important statement that I just made, because that is part of the teachings that we are receiving from others. You need to be able to return to cultural practices in order to heal from what has been a trauma and what has been issues for Indigenous people. So this is a quote. Addressing Indigenous health inequities requires focusing on changing underlying structural determinants rather than just addressing symptomatic effects, and needs to be done using a strength-based perspective that celebrates positive determinants such as connection to the land, relationships, and communities. So I'm going to be talking more about, so just keep that in mind when we talk about strength-based perspectives that celebrate positive determinants. I think that was a quote I'm going to put in my phone, and I'm going to keep reminding myself about. I need to keep an eye on time. Factors contributing to cultural revitalization and Indigenous success. So I'm going to talk about all of these areas a little bit more. So I'm not going to go into it right now, but the factors that I'm focusing on during this presentation is that are contributing to cultural revitalization and Indigenous success is actually Indigenous people themselves, the government, and then Canadian people. So I will, you'll see the words there. I'm going by it really quickly, but I will be talking about it. So I'll be repeating it. I got to take a drink of water. So the status of Indigenous health and well-being. So I wanted to dwell and focus on the positive. I will tell you that I've done my best, but I do have to make sure that I say that things still need a lot of work. And that is, but we will still look at what are the positive things and what is the positive direction in which some things are going. So according to Indigenous Services Canada, in recent years, the health indicators of Indigenous people are showing signs of improvement. So if they could just stay there and then, and then cite, things that it would be nice if that's where it ends. But we have to continue because, however, the issues remain significant and health improvements are not experienced by all Indigenous groups. So when we talk about the Indigenous groups, we've been talking kind of as a homogeneous group. And I've already identified that there are the three different groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So even amongst those groups, there are different variations of or degrees of issues being things being a problem or things improving. So another difference is whether you live in a First Nation or you live in a rural area or whether you live in an urban area. Again, that will create some differences. So there's so many factors to be able to say things are improving, but then there are statistics and there's research to be able to say maybe not so much for this one group. 47% of Indigenous people perceive that they have good physical and mental health, and this was a study that was from a Canada website in from 2017. Going back too far. And I know I put too many words in slides. It's something I need to work on. So the status of Indigenous health and wellness. So even though we're improving, there's some improvement, gaps remain wide in a whole lot of areas. So we continue to have shorter life expectancy. So the probability of living to age 75 was 53% for First Nation men and 66% for Indigenous females. And that's compared to 22 and 18 percentages lower than non-Indigenous people. So as a group, Métis were 64% uh, for males and 74% for females. And that was 10 to 12% lower than on non-indigenous. And Inuit without the E were 51% and 63% male and female respectively. And that was 35 to 21% lower compared to non-indigenous. So again, you get a sense that even within the groups that there is, there's some real concerns about life expectancy. Infant mortality rates are high, 2 to 3 times higher. Diabetes is 4 times higher. Opioid deaths are higher. And from my area, it was recorded as having the highest rates of opioid related deaths in 2022. And it's something that I'm keenly aware of because of where I live and the sadness in the deaths that have been occurring, and knowing that the communities are small and everybody knows each other. It really is a traumatic, very sad events that are happening. Tuberculosis is also 270 times higher for Inuit. Suicide rates are higher in some Indigenous communities, but in some communities, the rates are similar to the general population. So again, I'm trying to give you a sense of things that are different, but also are improved in some areas. Higher incidence of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And then I started getting vague because I just wanted to make sure that you are aware that there are a lot of chronic illnesses and comorbidities that Indigenous people experience that are much higher than the regular population. So other areas of concern are mental health and addictions, family violence, homicide, child mistreatment, or in care, incarceration, homelessness. So going through those and not trying to go into them too deeply, I just want to give a sense that there are still a lot of concerns. There's still a lot of work to be done. So again, I say colonial and government policies and practices, marginalization, discrimination, and other impositions experienced by Indigenous people have had a significant impact on their health and wellness. So the struggles now are referred to as intergenerational trauma. So it happened, it affected, it continues to impact generation after generation. So there are Indigenous-led holistic health and wellness programs that are now in trend, programs and services for Indigenous people are currently in the process of being transitioned to the jurisdiction of Indigenous people. So when we talked about self-determination, there are a number of areas now where, with the government saying you are right, Indigenous people are saying, you need to let us do this for ourselves. That's what self-determination is. We need to be able to address these and work with our own people towards holistic health and well-being. So these were just some of the different things, the different programs and services that are now within more of the hands of First Nations and other Indigenous groups that they are taking responsibility for. Culturally specific programs and services. Research shows that culturally based intervention approaches were significantly more effective in reducing substance use and related problems. So now I'm getting into things that are some of those programs that I talked about that are in Indigenous hands. So an example I'm giving you is one that's close to me. It's the name of the place is called Gwakwadzwin Mikan treatment, and it means living the right way. It's located here in Manitoulin. It's a 3-month, and I believe their care is they follow for 6 months, but it's a model of mental health and addiction treatment for Indigenous people. And what is really cool, first of all, is it's an extended program. It's traditional culture with therapeutic best practices and outdoor experiential learning. The focus is on land-based treatment and care. So I've been following the program for a while. It's fairly new, but it is the integration of traditional practices, living on the land, going out to an island, learning how to fish, learning how to net, learning how to clean fish, learning how to make a canoe, learning how to um, gather sap and make maple syrup. Those are things that they're doing on an ongoing basis, depending on the time of year. Their whole circles are within a very culturally based approach in terms of the way that they have their healing sessions as a group and then individually. So the expected outcomes are healthy future orientation, increased perception, a quality of life, decrease in suicidality, sorry, hospitalization, police involvement, homelessness, and problematic substance abuse. So their outcomes for the program and its degree of success is very promising. So there are other besides Indigenous services being in Indigenous hands. There is other culturally specific programs and services that are being offered and available in non-Indigenous settings as well. So wherever there is higher concentrations of Indigenous people, you will find that they will have hospitals may have well, first of all, there is an Indigenous hospital up in the north. Um, Hospitals can have spiritual rooms, very specific palliative, family-friendly rooms, and so on. They may have staff, say for my knowledge is of for cancer. There's different individuals who are Indigenous that are there to support Indigenous patients and so on. Indigenous specific community health clinics and centers within Indigenous communities and urban centers. There's Indigenous friendship centers. There's midwifery, mental health and addictions, homeless and crisis shelters, and in jails, and so on. So I wanted to give some positive things that are, that there are improvements. So to safe drinking water, the access of Indigenous people to clean drinking water has improved. Since 2016, 626 water and wastewater projects have been completed in 581 First Nation communities. So they didn't have potable, drinkable water before that. Between 2015 and 2020, I can tell I'm talking too much because I'm starting to get tired of talking. 97 long-term drinking water advisories were lifted. And there are, however, still First Nations without safe drinking water today. And those are things that continue to be part of the problems. So education, and I have to keep an eye on the time. The number of Indigenous people successfully completing from post-secondary is growing. As of 2017, more Indigenous people have completed post-secondary education in Canada. And again, the discrepancies are with the different Indigenous groups. The Assembly of First Nations found nearly half of Indigenous post-secondary graduates had attained a college level designation. University, we're still struggling, but there are more Indigenous Indigenous students successfully graduating from university, but those we are less likely, and that still is, we are lower than the average Canadian average. So here's the really cool part of this projection. A direct cumulative economic benefit to Canada in closing the Indigenous educational attainment gap between 2011 and 2031 is estimated to be $26.1 billion. So there is an economic benefit to Canada in the growing number of Indigenous people attaining a degree or a post-secondary designation. So income is still bad. in 2021, almost 1 in 5 Indigenous people in Canada live in low-income household, and that is compared to non-Indigenous people at 10.7%. So it's been down, and they feel that it's down most in more recent studies or collection of data because of COVID. So Indigenous educational attainment is closing gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous wage earners, and culturally relevant education improves the odds of both attaining education and economic successes for Indigenous people. So research suggests that household income plays a role in educational attainment of Indigenous family members. So the greater the education attainment, the higher the income is projected to be. So Indigenous owned companies, as of 2021, it was reported that there are 50,000 Indigenous owned companies, defined as 51, the owner is 51% or more is Indigenous who owns the company. And the and what they have identified is that they contribute up to $30 billion each year to the Canadian economy. And that is, so if there's 50,000 Indigenous owned companies in Canada, there's 1 million small businesses at the same time. The potential is for Indigenous owned businesses through procurement, investment, and other supports. Indigenous businesses could contribute up to 100 billion. So again, those are stats that I've identified the source for them. So I identified a number of different existing businesses, but it would be across the board, similar to the general population. So changes in government policies and practices has also contributed to helping support Indigenous people. So there's been, in recent years, level of government have committed to ongoing engagement and consultation regarding the development of programs and services used by them, treaty negotiations, and land claims. So about residential schools and day schools, and you would have heard a lot about that in the past few years. More recently, missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women and girls, mental health and addictions, economic development involving Indigenous lands, Jordan's Principle. So I'm just naming a few of the developments that are intended to address and support Indigenous people. The voices and involvement of Indigenous people will further enhance Indigenous health, well-being, and socio-economic standing as viable participants and partners within Canada. So I gave some examples of government support for Indigenous business growth. It is now 7:48, so I know I have to go just a little bit quicker, and I'm almost done. So supportive companies.
Well, Pamela, I just wanted to say we are a slightly smaller group today. So I just wanted to interrupt you just very quickly and ask everyone if we wanted to have a question session at the end of this lecture, because if the answer is no, then you can really just take your time and not have to rush through the last couple of slides. So for the few people who are here, if you agree that you would rather just finish the lecture at a nice slower pace, maybe just let me know in the Q&A function if you have any questions, and we can finish the presentation and then get to those as well. But we're just a slightly smaller group tonight, so I thought I'd just ask if anybody had a preference, and I didn't want you to feel, Pamela, that you had to rush through your final slides tonight. So I think
I'm on slide 37 and I'm going to 44, so I'm not too bad.
Yeah. So I think don't worry about rushing too quickly. And then if people have questions at the end, that's fine. But we're a slightly smaller group, so it's okay to just finish up and not feel too rushed. Okay.
No problem. Thanks, Christine. So support of companies, institutions, and businesses. So in order to grow as successful and economic contributors, Indigenous people need the support of the business community. So supporting Indigenous businesses, 77% agree that Canadian corporations should include Indigenous owned and operated businesses in supplier networks wherever possible. So these are businesses that were part of survey. Research showed that 72% believe Indigenous businesses are needed to support sustainable economic opportunities for Indigenous people and communities. So remember, we've been talking about self-determination and the need to be able to help oneself. And so it just makes sense that in order for individuals, communities, families to be supported, it makes sense that Indigenous businesses should be growing. Provide training and mentoring as a long-term strategy. Hire and promote skilled, experienced, and educated Indigenous employees. So there are programs that have been put in place to support that. Provide Indigenous cultural training, recognition of Indigenous land base. So I attend a lot of, I'm on a number of different boards, and it has been growing for maybe the last few years, where there's been land acknowledgements, respect for knowing that Indigenous people, very specific groups, were from the land that either the business or the wherever the meeting is being held. So it is as the only Indigenous person sometimes there, I feel like there's a sense that I should be acknowledging, personally, that the land acknowledgement is going on, but to be able to say, it's awkward for me, but at the same time, it still feels really good to be able to know that people are getting a sense that Indigenous people were here from time immemorial, and the fact that there's some recognition for the group that was from that specific that land. So I just wanted to give you a sense of that from my perspective. Changing perceptions regarding Indigenous people. So I think this is where I wanted to get to be the most important slide. So because of the poor health, wellness, and social economic issues faced by Indigenous people, I know that that's what we talk about a lot. And I know that that's what my presentations have really focused on. And it can't be helped. That's what I can say. Those issues exist. It is important that Canadians know, that there is inequities, that there is people who have been marginalized, who are suffering. But at the same time, the unfortunate thing about that is that then we are often seen from a deficit-based lens. And Indigenous people, despite the issues and trials, we see ourselves differently. Um, we emphasize our pride in culture and traditions, our communities, our self-determination, our humor, our language. We are very proud of who we are. And so we see ourselves, and we would like to be seen as from a strength-based perspective. So despite talking to you about the issues and the struggles that are being experienced, I really hope that you get a sense that there is a really cool people. And I think I said that the last time, that there is something really amazing about Indigenous cultures that are willing to be shared, and that people, if they're interested, can learn more about. So through interacting and working with Indigenous people, care providers, the government, politicians, organizations, institutions, the business community, and Canadians in general must begin to change perspectives, concepts about Indigenous people. A good start is beginning with a focus on wellness and the strengths of Indigenous people and their communities. So as a wrap up, the reality and life experiences are complex and different from other Canadians. We experience of the experiences of the marginalization, discriminatory practices, colonization, greater health, wellness, and socioeconomic struggles. Resiliency, though, despite struggles, unique cultures moving forward towards revitalization of our culture and traditions, the importance of self-determination and making decisions for self, families, and communities. The way toward holistic health and wellness and social economic standing is moving forward slowly. And I say that as a positive person. and Shirley. So regaining cultural identity is part of the steps. Importance of removing barriers of marginalization and discrimination and working together. The importance of providing opportunities to support growth, and more importantly, recognizing and promoting strengths of minority cultures. So that's transferable to other minorities as well. Recognitions and steps to address past harms have been done. And I just went way fast. I went forward. So at the end, this is the circle that I talked about where we were holistic and self-sustaining people, and some of the things that happened along the way, and that now we are looking to be self-sustaining original peoples, and that we are working with Canadians and all of the other stakeholders in authentic truth and reconciliation efforts towards becoming self-sustaining people. So that is where I am. The next presentation is about the Truth and Reconciliation Report, and to be able to say what were the key findings, and to be able to say how can they be put together, how can they be brought forward and continue to be brought forward in practical terms. And so thank you for those who were here today, and for those that are listening on Facebook. I really appreciate your time, and I'm hoping that this presentation was insightful, and I hope that you did not fall asleep.